Thanks very much. Show of hands, how many of you think literacy is a critical skill set and that Canada has a literacy challenge? Right, so you're the wrong audience for this presentation. Right, because I'll be honest with you, one of the biggest challenges that we have is a lack of awareness. About 4 years ago, TD approached me and asked me if I'd write a research report on the state of literacy in Canada. And I have to be honest, I knew nothing about the subject before I started doing the research. And I couldn't imagine that Canada could possibly have a literacy problem. We have a caring, inclusive society. How could we have a problem with such a fundamental thing like literacy? So I was absolutely shocked when I started to look at the official statistics. And what I found was that the data that was available from the international survey showed that in actual fact, an awful lot of Canadians don't have the essential skills that they need to really unlock their potential in a modern knowledge-based economy. I was stunned to learn that 4 in 10 youths, 5 in 10 adults didn't have the desired level of literacy for reading or prose. And in fact, as an economist, I was quite shocked to learn that almost 6 in 10 Canadians don't have the desired level of numeracy. And this plays into things like financial literacy. Now, I spend a lot of time in the United States. People don't realize it, but TD now has more branches in the US than we do in Canada. So I spend my life going up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States. And I can tell you that literacy and financial literacy materially contributed to the housing bubble and the housing crash that they had in the United States. So if you actually want a case study in the impact that weak literacy and financial literacy skills have, you actually have the ideal case coming out of the US experience. Now, like many of you, when I'm at home on weekends and I get together with my friends, everybody tends to talk about what they're doing. Now, my usual experience is the minute I start talking, their eyes start to glaze over. But I found actually that when I raised the issue around literacy and I started talking about the statistics, my friends actually became very animated. And it was then that the light bulb went on that we have an awareness problem. And I think part of the challenge is that people that have strong literacy skills completely take them for granted. They actually can't envision a world where they didn't have those skills. It's very difficult to put yourself in the other person's shoes. I also think, though, that there's an awareness issue on the part that there are some individuals that have weak literacy skills but actually don't realize that this is acting as a constraint or impediment on their prospects. You know, I got in a lot of trouble. I did an interview on national TV about the fact that many people that don't have, you know, the adequate desired level of literacy aren't aware of the fact that they're in that position. And I said, in fact, I have family members in that situation. You know, you can see where this is going, right? So, you know, the next day I get a phone call from my mother-in-law who says, okay, who? Right? But I think part of the challenge is that we think about literacy in a binary way. You know, we tend to think of it as being something like either you are literate or you're not. But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is literacy being an essential skill, and it's basically a spectrum of proficiency, going from extremely weak or negligible all the way up to remarkably strong. And what we have is an economy that over time is requiring more sophisticated skills. And at the end of the day, if you don't actually have the right building blocks, if you don't have the foundational skill set that you need, you can't actually build the other ones on top of it. So at the end of the day, I think of literacy as basically being the great enabler. You know, if you have strong literacy skills, it starts opening the door to many opportunities. And you know, when we think about the statistics, some of you in this room are going to be far more knowledgeable about this subject than I am, because I've only been doing it for a few years. And I'm, as the economist in the bank, my time is spread across a wide array of topics and subject matter. So some of you are going to be much more knowledgeable about the subject than I am. But what I can basically tell you is that we're trying to raise awareness around this issue because we can see that there are challenges that are out there. Now, when we think about youth literacy, what we can actually see is Canada actually does very well on a relative basis. When you start looking at Canadian youth literacy scores on the PISA survey and you compare it to other countries, we're doing very well. Now, this data, it was pointed out by one person that the data in this presentation is dated because the PISA scores that I have is from 2003, but I don't fundamentally believe anything has changed dramatically in the last 7 years. So we have a situation where in relative terms, Canada ranks extremely high on the international scales. We do see in youth literacy some variation though, and there's some regional variation. We can see that Western Canada generally tends to be towards the top of the band. Atlantic Canada, unfortunately, tends to be towards the bottom, or at least are lower on the scale. Nova Scotia is closer to the national average than New Brunswick or PEI. And we can also see within the youth scores, although again, in overall metrics, we're doing quite well, particularly when you compare it internationally. What we can see is that the children from disadvantaged families, from low-income families, have the weakest literacy scores. So if we're thinking about vulnerable parts of the population, within the youth community, you tend to start focusing more on those coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. But also, when I benchmarked the PISA scores to make them comparable to the international adult literacy scores, the conclusion that I reached working with Scott Murray, formerly from Statistics Canada, was that the comparable number was about 4 in 10 youths aren't hitting the desired level. But when we turn to adult literacy, the scores get even worse. You might notice that they don't call it a dismal science for nothing. I'm actually not going to cheer you up. The presentation just gets steadily more pessimistic as we go. So if we think about the adult literacy scores, it's 5 in 10 don't have the desired level of prose or document literacy, and close to 6 in 10 don't have the desired level of numeracy. I was quite shocked when I started looking at some of the statistics where it works out to being about 25% of Canadians have no idea how you calculate simple interest. Okay, as a banker, this worries me. How do you make informed financial decisions if you're having a fundamental problem with things like what is basic interest and how is it calculated? What's the implication of it? So in the United States, I remember talking with a woman who she'd come to the bank to try and get TD to give her financial support because her current mortgage lender was going to foreclose on her home. And I asked her about what the mortgage product that she had. And she had one of these adjustable rate mortgages in the US where for the first 2 years you got a very low teaser rate of interest. But after 2 years, your interest rate would reset. And all of a sudden, 2 years later, your interest rate would go up by, it would go from like sort of 6% to about 10%. So it was a 4 percentage point increase. Now it's written in a contract. It says this is what's going to happen to you. It's not like a variable mortgage we have in Canada where you're going to, find out the Bank of Canada raised rates and your cost of borrowing's gone up. No, no, no. This is a legal contract that says in 24 months' time this is what's going to happen to you. And it turns out that when the mortgage reset, she couldn't make the payments. And so the bank was going to foreclose on her. So I asked her how she could end up in this situation. I asked her about, didn't she understand the terms of the contract? And the response I got back was, well, the person I dealt with said that it was going to go up 4%, and that didn't sound like much. She didn't actually have any capability of taking the 4 percentage point increase and figure out what it meant for her monthly payments. If the banker had sat down and said, this is what's going to happen to your monthly payments, I'm pretty convinced she would have never taken on that mortgage in the first place. Now that's a US example. But in truth, I think it does have Canadian parallels, that a lot of Canadians have a lot of difficulty with basic math, basic financial calculations. Now, when we delve a little below this, and again, many of you are going to be very familiar with this data, and if you are, I'm sorry for dragging you slowly through it, but there's actually, on the adult survey, the International Adult Survey, there's 5 categories, but there's so few people at the 5th category, they tend to lump the top 2 categories together. And in the data, they call them, they come up with a very clever nomenclature. They call them levels 1, 2, 3, 4. That doesn't really describe things. So the way I think about it is level 1 is poor. It goes from rudimentary to sort of poor. Level 2 is weak. Level 3 is adequate. Level 4 is strong. And I would say on the awareness side, people who are in level 1 actually probably recognize that they could benefit from stronger skills. I suspect, though, an awful lot of people that are in category 2 do not appreciate that they don't have the skill set at the desired level and that there's a lost opportunity there. And I would also say that if you're having a conversation with somebody who's in the level 2 category, you have to be very careful how you hold the conversation. Because if you go in and say, you're not literate enough, the other person's likely to hit you or get angry, right? But I think it's very important to raise the awareness that investing more in these skills can actually pay off huge dividends. And I'm going to come to how big those dividends can be. So in Canada, what we have is 2 in 10 are at the level 1, 3 in 10 are at the level 2, and that's how the 5 in 10 number breaks down. Then the vast majority of Canadians, or the largest segment, is at the desired level, and then there's a smaller portion at strong. Again, when we look at the distribution, what we find is that Western Canada tends to have slightly above average statistics. New Brunswick, Newfoundland, Quebec are below the average, and most of the other provinces are sort of collected around the national average, close enough that you can't statistically tell them really apart. But there are some segments that it is very clear that there is, greater risk. Again, for adults, lower income individuals tend to have lower literacy scores. First Nations tend to have lower literacy scores, and so do immigrants. And on the immigrant side, it basically breaks down as 3 in 10 have poor, and 3 in 10 are weak. So we're talking about that, a 6 in 10 number not hitting the desired level of literacy. Now, I want to stress something very important here. I'm talking about literacy in Canada's 2 official languages. I am not talking about their literacy in their native tongue. In many cases, they are extraordinarily literate in their native language, but it's not English or French. So we can see that the immigrant population is particularly weak, or at least is a greater at-risk population. And this is a real challenge for Canada, because last year, all net new jobs were filled by immigrants. Net labor force creation was all immigration. And before long, we're actually going to see 100% of Canadian population growth coming from immigration because of the aging of the population. This is being reflected in Canadian society. You can see how much more diverse the urban centers are becoming. In fact, Canada has the 2nd or the 3rd highest immigration flows of any industrialized country. Australia is one of the few that's sort of higher than us. And immigrants don't spread themselves equally across the country. They tend to get concentrated in certain urban centers, but it's changing. Because of the provincial nominee program, we're actually now seeing provinces like Manitoba, which couldn't in the past really attract many immigrants, becoming a more popular destination. And so from the point of view of Atlantic Canada, while it's true that more of the immigrants go to the GTA or Vancouver or Calgary, at the end of the day, over time, we're going to see that the provincial nominee program, combined with the overall number of immigrants coming in, it is going to lead to greater diversity in the Atlantic population. So this is an important issue. And unfortunately, we are doing an atrocious job at integrating newcomers into the economy. There's no other way of describing it. We are doing a very poor job. So when we think about income of newcomers, what you'll see is that back in the late 70s, early 80s, if you came into Canada, you were earning about 85 cents on the dollar relative to a Canadian-born individual. Today, that ratio has widened out to closer to about 60 to 62 cents. And it doesn't matter whether you're looking at it by gender. And what you can see is that over time, whereas in the late 70s, early 80s, if you came into the country and you were earning 85 cents on the dollar, so you're earning 15 cents less than a Canadian-born individual, you could actually close the gap over your working lifetime. But today, there's absolutely no hope that you're ever going to close the gap. And again, it doesn't matter whether you look at this from the point of view of men or women, the gap has gotten steadily bigger and the ability to close the gap has been diminished. And it also is reflected in the very high unemployment rates that exist for immigrants. Before the recession, so when we had a 30-year low unemployment rate, we had widespread labor shortages. Immigrants coming into the country were facing an unemployment rate. Immigrants that had a university degree were having an unemployment rate that was higher than for Canadians that only had high school. Just imagine how hard it is to get a good job in today's labor market if you only have high school. And these people are coming in with foreign work experience, they're coming in with foreign education, university degrees, and they're having a worse labor market outcome than Canadians that only have high school. And if you have weaker employment numbers and you have a widening income gap, it translates into overall household income. So if you have an immigrant that doesn't have a degree, and you compare it to a Canadian that doesn't have a diploma or a degree, the Canadian is earning on average $32,500, the immigrant's earning $18,500. The difference is a mere $14,000 a year, compounded over every year the person is statistically in the country. Well, the average Canadian with a university degree is getting $51,600. The immigrant is getting $27,000 less per year. This is a problem. And what it ultimately means is that you're ending up with much higher percentage of newcomers ending up in poverty. Now, there's a lot of ways of defining poverty. I often get a lot of flack by different groups about how you define it. But if I just use the low-income cutoff as one metric, more than a third of newcomers at some point in time are going to experience poverty in Canada. So when I first started presenting this, I got a lot of pushback because some very knowledgeable people said, yeah, but it depends on what class of immigrant you're talking about. If it's refugees or family reunification class, it's completely different than foreign skilled workers. Actually, I don't see a huge difference. Refugees are weaker, but I don't see a material difference. So we clearly have a problem. We're probably losing about $3.5 to $5 billion a year from underemployment of immigrants. What I'm telling you, though, is something that government has known for a very long time. Statistics Canada has done a lot of work on it, a lot of research. In fact, a few years ago when I was writing a report on this, there had been, at that point, 64 research papers written. Now it's closer to 80. I know, because I've read them all. And what you can see in it is that it's very clear that language does play a role. Now, part of the reason is just the nature of where we're getting the immigrants from. More of them are coming from non-English and French-speaking countries. So if you go back in time and you go back to the early 90s, more than 50% were coming from Europe. Now, more than 50% are coming from Asia. So it's very natural that you're going to have greater language challenges. And if you ask newcomers about their situation, and you ask them what are the biggest challenges they're having, number one and number two tend to be Difficulty finding an adequate job. So this is the StatsCan survey. You know, what's your biggest challenge? Number one, finding an adequate job. Second problem, learning a new language. Okay, well, I remember wandering around a Chapters one day, and I was in the business book section, and there was a book on key things you needed to do to make a favorable impression in an interview. And one of the things it said for men was, for heaven's sakes, make sure your shoes are polished, because your probability of getting a job drops by about 30% if you don't have your shoes polished. If shining your shoes are important to landing a job, just imagine how important communication skills are. You know, and what you often hear is that there's problems around recognizing education in terms of the value of foreign education, recognizing the value of foreign work experience, right? But if the person doesn't have the language skills they need, they actually can't convey what their skills are. So the StatsCan survey showed adequate job was number one, learning a new language was number two. Well, number three was credential recognition. So language actually rated higher in terms of a challenge than actually even their credentials. Now, economists never agree by definition. So if you actually look at the economic research, there's a debate out there. There's some of the researchers say that language skills are responsible for about 2/3 of the earning gap that's happening. But some of the very top researchers at StatsCan says no, actually it's not 2/3, it's closer to 1/3 of the income gap is being caused by language and culture. I gotta be honest, you know what? I don't care. What you know is that language is a big part of the challenge. You can debate about whether it's 1/3 or 2/3. Nevertheless, if you improved the language skills, you would actually have a better outcome, period. So that was a very long digression on immigrants, but I'm sorry, I find that very shocking. And quite frankly, I could do the same tangent on First Nations, because the literacy scores are about the same. About 6 in 10 don't have the desired level of language and literacy skills. And as I said, I view literacy as being the great enabler. If you have stronger literacy skills, you are more likely to go on to post-secondary education. You are more likely to succeed at post-secondary education. You are also more likely to do continuing education. People with stronger literacy skills tend to do adult education. And in today's environment, today's ever-changing labor market, you absolutely have to maintain your skill sets, or else you are going to find that if you get displaced in the labor market, you have a lot of trouble re-engaging and finding gainful employment. So continuing education is critical. We can see that higher literacy skills correspond to higher employment rates. And when you go from level 1 to level 4, you basically go from an employment rate of 57% to an employment rate of over 80%. What's interesting also, I don't have a slide in this, but not only does higher literacy skills correlate with higher employment rates, but if you are less likely to become unemployed, and your average duration of unemployment, if you are at level 3, is half of the duration of unemployment that you typically get with level 1 and level 2. Again, going back to that point that you're much easier to re-engage in the labor market if something untoward has happened. Obviously, higher literacy skills open up more opportunity in terms of what jobs you might be able to pursue. And ultimately, I'm sorry, I'm an economist. We always come back to dollars and cents. Right? So if you go from level 1 to level 4, you're basically you're doubling your income. The single biggest financial investment you can make is the amount of education you take. The rate of return on the investment, yes, tuition rates have gone up. Yes, it's getting more costly to pursue post-secondary education, but the rate of return that you're going to get on that investment over your lifetime dramatically exceeds the rate of investment you're going to get on any other financial investment you make, whether it's investing in real estate or stocks or bonds. At the end of the day, education and what it does to in terms of lifting your income is the single best investment you can make. If you don't want to talk about the dollars and cents, there's a lot of stats that show that stronger literacy scores also correlate to higher civic engagement, higher rates of volunteering, and so on. So if you want a more engaged civic population, investment in this is well worth the money. Now, it may sound a little strange having a bank economist talk about this sort of thing, but at the end of the day, I worry a lot about the Canadian economy. I worry about its long-term prospects. I would say our #1 economic challenge is the fact that we have abysmal productivity. We have extraordinarily weak innovation. At the end of the day, your economy grows either because of one of two things. You either have more workers or you're using those workers more productively. Well, we have an aging population. Population growth is slowing. So we have to do better in terms of creating a more innovative labor market. And at the end of the day, when you talk to policymakers about this, the thing you have to drive home is that the tax base for Canadian governments is determined by what's actually happening to economic growth and income. If you actually want to be able to have the healthcare system and the social security system that you want, you actually need to have a productive, efficient, and competitive economy to be able to generate the taxes to provide those social services. And Canada has very weak productivity growth. We don't tend to invest as much in machinery, equipment, and capital, which in general, if you give workers more capital, they tend to be more productive. So Canada underinvests in plant and equipment, so we've been encouraging businesses to do more in terms of investing. But from a Canadian point of view, if you're going to underinvest in capital, that even makes it more important that you have to invest in labor. You have to be able to have the labor delivering the innovation that you need. And we have entered a world where the labor market is very unstable. My father graduated from college and he went to work for Westinghouse and he stayed at Westinghouse his whole career. Right? People entering the labor market today are not going to have that experience. On average, you're probably going to have 3 or 4 employers over your working career, and you're probably going to change the nature of your job at least twice over your working career. And you can see the impact that the changing world is having in terms of the manufacturing sector is becoming a smaller part of the overall Canadian economy. Services are climbing as a share of the economy, and within the services category, it's high-skilled services that are growing the fastest. In other words, we have a lot of demand for high-skilled workers. We cannot compete with countries like China and India and Brazil on labor costs. The only way we can compete is by having a better product. And the only way you have a better product is you have a better labor force, a more educated labor force, a more skilled labor force. And while the unemployment rate has risen during this recent recession and recovery, make no mistake, skills shortages are going to reappear as the aging population plays out. In fact, I had an interesting conversation about 2 weeks ago with the new premier from Alberta, and she had met with the Quebec premier the day before, and she said that she was completely befuddled over the fact that when she talked to about Quebec, it's all about unemployment rising, whereas in Alberta, the biggest challenge they're having is labor shortages. So Alberta is already hitting the labor shortages. The rest of the economy is going to see them emerge as the economic recovery proceeds. And there'll be years of strength and years of weakness, but make no mistake, over the next 20 years, there's going to be increased demand for high-skilled workers. And I'm not actually optimistic about our ability to actually deliver all the skilled workers that are going to be required. So if you take all those stats around what the correlation is between literacy and income and employment, etc., and you did a back-of-the-envelope set of calculations, and I really mean this is back-of-the-envelope. This is not precise. But if I simply held everything else constant and I raised people that are in the poor category of literacy and the weak category of literacy, and I moved them up one category, and I give them the income of that category and the employment of that category, the outcome is you create 800,000 net new jobs, 3.5 years worth of employment creation. You lower the unemployment rate by about a percentage point, and because you're moving people up the skills curve, you actually end up creating more productivity. So StatsCan's done an estimation where if you increase literacy by 1%, you increase labor productivity by 2.5%, and you increase output per worker by 1.5%. These are very high rates of return on investment. So again, if we did it back of the envelope, a 1% increase in literacy, basically you're talking about $32 billion. That's $32 billion that can be used in the healthcare system. It's $32 billion that can be used for education. And raising literacy, if you actually, at the extreme, raised literacy scores to everybody had adequate, the net increase would be about $80 to $100 billion. Now, in actual fact, this estimate is probably too high. And the reason it's too high is that if everybody actually had the desired level of literacy, employers actually wouldn't pay a premium for workers that have those higher skills, because everybody would have them, right? So it's probably not the case that it's 80 or 100 billion, but the point here is we're talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars of payoff if we can increase the skills that Canadians have. Now, when I'm doing a business presentation, I start with this slide. Because I actually come in and I say, okay, imagine I'm a consultant and I want to come to you, and I say, I've got a product for you. Here's what my product does. If you buy my product, it will increase your output and product profitability. It'll lower your error rates. It'll increase your ability to do on-the-job training. It'll lead to a better team performance. It'll improve labor relations. It'll increase the quality of work. It'll reduce the time per task. It will lead to better health and safety records and better employee and customer retention. Are you interested in my product? But this is what literacy does. Right? This is from a conference board survey that was done of employers. If you actually think about it, from an employer point of view, this list basically encompasses everything. Which goes back to my point that maybe the way you think about literacy is it's a great enabler. It allows you to do an awful lot more. And unfortunately, so far, the data doesn't show signs that the literacy scores are overall improving. Now, one of the criticisms that I often get by people who are very knowledgeable and are very keenly statistically inclined is that if you think about what's happening on the immigrant side, right, it could be, you're bringing in more skilled immigrants, but they have weaker literacy scores. And as a consequence, if you have a greater portion of your population as immigrants, and you know the immigrants actually have a literacy score, let's say 6 in 10 aren't having the desired level of literacy. If they are a bigger portion of your population, you're not going to see any improvement. If you stripped out the immigrants, right, you'd actually see steady improvement. Of course, my rebuttal is the immigrants are actually in the economy, and it's actually the economy's overall condition that matters. So at the end of the day, what I really wanted to, the message that I send to people, because you're not the right audience for this presentation. You guys already know literacy is important. But the message I'm trying to send to businesses, to chambers of commerce, is that investing in literacy brings very strong sustainable gains to individuals, to businesses, to the economy, to society. It leads to a more democratic country. It can actually deal with some of the core challenges we have out there. If you're worried about poverty, investing in literacy will help alleviate some of that challenge. It won't make it all go away, but it'll help. In fact, my big frustration I've encountered is that when somebody calls me up and says, will you come and do a presentation in Vancouver to the Chamber of Commerce, I say, sure, can I come talk about literacy? And then the person on the other end of the phone gets really quiet. And there's sort of a, well, we were actually thinking maybe you'd come and talk about, the local economy, the Vancouver real estate market, is it a bubble? And they go through this whole slew of things that they'd rather talk about than literacy. So the way I've ended up actually trying to get my message out is actually by taking literacy and bolting it on to other topics. So, if somebody wants, the Innovation Council of Alberta wants a presentation, you know what? There's a couple of literacy slides sort of surreptitiously stuck into the deck. If I get invited to come and talk about, the overall economy, and we start looking at the long-term trends, and we talk about the fiscal challenges governments are having, I get back into, let's talk about productivity, let's talk about trying to improve skills, let's try to improve the outcome that labor is having, let's talk about challenges immigrants are having. And for example, last week we put out a report by my team on immigration reform. And there's a section in it all about language skills. In fact, I've come to the conclusion I almost defy you to come up with a topic of public policy that I can't link literacy to. Right? You're worried about healthcare? Well, more literate people tend to be more aware of the things they should and shouldn't do. Right? You're worried about education? Give people more of the basic skills, they'll get more education. Right? And you can keep going. Right? If you look at climate change, environmental awareness, etc., you know what? A more literate Canadian population will be more engaged in the discussion and they'll be more aware of the issues. So at the end of the day, that's the challenge I've run into. And the thing I find is that Canadians, again, don't truly appreciate that we have a challenge. They don't appreciate, if they have strong literacy skills, they actually don't envision how we have a challenge, because they take their skills for granted, and a lot of the people that are actually in need of support don't appreciate the challenge. I was a mentor as part of the TRIAC programs. And I had a couple of mentees that I was helping that were newcomers, and one of them was from Ghana. And he was having an enormous communication challenge. He had experience from the IMF, from the World Bank. He had a PhD in economics. He had a master's of business administration. He had completed 2 levels of the CFA, the Chartered Financial Analyst program, but he couldn't communicate his skill set. And when I engaged him in the conversation around needing to improve his English skills, he got really upset. So what I did was I took him to, we have a studio where we do webcasts and things like that. And I took him over to where the camera was, and I sat him down and we did a mock interview from start to finish. And then I played it back for him, and I got him to actually see how he was sitting, hear how he was talking, and very quickly he had this realization that he was having a big challenge on the communication front. Now, with respect to various mentees I've had with TRIAC, most of them have been successful. This particular case actually ended in tears, because he actually went back to Ghana because he found it just too hard. And it really was upsetting, because we had somebody who actually had incredibly strong technical skills, but he didn't have the communication skills to succeed in the current labor market. And I think that if I had one recommendation to businesses and to business leaders, it's if they ever have the opportunity to take part in those sort of mentoring-mentee programs, it can be a real eye-opener, because all of a sudden you actually start to feel what people that are facing the language and literacy challenges are actually experiencing, and it opens your eyes.